Harry's mum was reading him a bedtime story. Harry didn't like bedtime stories. It wasn't that he disliked them, he just wasn't a massive fan. But Harry would never complain. He would sit quietly and listen to his mum read whatever story she chose. Sometimes she would choose nice stories about dinosaurs dancing or bears in search of their sons. But sometimes she would choose weird stories, scary stories. Harry really didn't like the scary stories. But despite Harry's complaints, his mum would read them to him. She would tell him that he was brave and that he had done such a great job listening. Harry never felt like he'd done a great job listening. Most of the time he didn't listen. He would sit in his bed and pull the sheets as close to himself as possible. He would hide as far away from the story as he could, and his mum would have this concerned look on her face. She would try and comfort Harry. She would stroke his hair, hold his hand, and ask if he was okay. Harry always responded with yes, even when he wasn't. He couldn't help but try and make his mother feel better. He hated seeing her worry. So he would lie to her, say that he was fine when he wasn't, and then sit in his bed and stop listening. Tonight's story started out very happy. Harry was enjoying it. He had seen the cover of the book and gotten quite excited. The cover was of a little girl with a picnic basket and a cheeky wolf. He assumed the wolf and the girl were friends. They seemed so happy on the cover. But Harry was surprised to find that the little girl was all alone at the start of the book. She was just walking down the forest to her grandma's house. Harry's surprise quickly faded as he started to think about going to Grandma's house. He liked going to Grandma's house. So much so that he decided to tell his mum this. He'd expected Mum to say that she liked going to Grandma's house too. But instead, she had the worried look on her face. Harry wasn't sure why his mum was worried. Had he done something wrong? His mum kept on reading, and the girl finally got to her grandma's house. The little girl went to her grandma's room and sat beside her as she laid in her bed. Her grandma was the wolf. Harry was completely lost. He thought he'd been listening well to this story. Why was her grandma the wolf? And why did the wolf have such sharp teeth? And why did the wolf have such a devilish grin? Harry slowly started to lift the bed sheets up to his face. His mum noticed and started to hold his hand as she read on. Harry didn't notice the reading, of course. He had stopped listening. He just saw the pictures. Each time his mum turned the page, all he saw was another, scarier picture of the wolf. Each one scarier than the last. He couldn't understand. Why would someone write such a happy story and then ruin it? Thankfully, the wolf didn't eat the little girl. Once Harry's mum finished the story, she asked Harry if he had any questions. Harry usually never did. But this time was different. This time, he had one question. What happened to Grandma? His mum looked at Harry worried once again. Harry suddenly didn't want his question answered. He didn't want to make one worry. But she answered anyway. She was eaten. By the wolf. Harry held his bedsheets tight. His mum sat back down next to him and began to comfort him like before. It's okay. It's just a story. She would say it over and over. Is Grandma okay? Our Grandma. Will she be eaten by a wolf? Harry asked another question. Harry's mum comforted him again. She looked really worried this time. Grandma won't be eaten by wolves, or monsters, or ghouls, or goblins, okay? Harry nodded and stopped hugging her, and she in turn stopped comforting him. His mum stood up again and went to leave Harry's room, but stopped before she left. I'm going to turn the light off, okay? Harry shook his head at her. You're going to have to sleep with them off at some point. Come on, Harry. You can do it. Just this one night. Harry shook his head once more. Harry, what are you so afraid of? Monsters? Harry nodded his head. Harry's mum sat back down in his bed and held his hand once more. Harry, monsters aren't real. They're not real. These stories are not real. Harry nodded. No, I need to hear you say it. Please, say it. Monsters aren't real. Harry spoke the words to his mum. Of course he didn't believe them himself, but he spoke them anyway. His mum stood up for the final time. Can I turn the light off now? Harry and his mum stared at each other for a silent moment. He hated seeing his mother like this. He hated it. So he nodded. And with a flick of the switch, the lights went out. His mum was gone. Disappeared in the darkness. He was now alone. Harry's attempts at falling asleep were numerous, but all of them led to the same conclusion. He would shut his eyes as tight as he could. He would hide under the sheets. He would make a pillow fort out of the 2 pillows he had. Nothing worked. He couldn't sleep, not even a little bit. He gave up on sleeping and decided to just lay in bed and wait for the morning. Lying on his side, eyes open, Harry looked out into the darkness. It was just as dark as before, and it's just as dark as when he closed his eyes. In his experimentation, he'd found out that if he closed his eyes too tight, they started to hurt. And he also found out that had forgotten how to close his eyes properly. So he decided it made no difference, and kept them open. A few minutes went by, and then some moonlight started to peek through the curtains of his window. Harry could see. He couldn't see much. Honestly, it only reminded Harry of how little he could see. But still, he found comfort in the small amount of light given to him. But when Harry looked again, that comfort was snuffed out and replaced with fear. He saw it. Movement. A shadow. Or maybe that's what it looked like. It was shifting, scurrying on the ground. He watched it rustle and wiggle in the same place. He just watched it. It was all he could do. He couldn't sleep. There was a thing in his bedroom. A monster. A real monster. So he just watched it for hours. Maybe it was hours. Maybe it was minutes. Could have been seconds. His clock was on the other side of the bed, and Harry was determined not to take his eyes off the creature. So he stared and stared. Stared until his eyes were red. Stared until he couldn't stare anymore. And eventually, it went away. The shifting disappeared. Harry had finally scared it off with all the staring. Harry felt quite proud of himself. He'd just defeated a monster. He started to imagine telling his mum about all this in the morning. But then he remembered what she'd said to him. Then he felt something. Something on his back. It was like a claw, but not a claw. Something soft, or rubbery, or something that Harry couldn't describe. All he knew is that he felt something. Then he felt a breath. Something was breathing on him. But the breath wasn't cold, nor was it warm. And it didn't have the same moist quality. It was dry. And then it groaned. It groaned with a sound that no human could make. A groan so absurd that Harry could barely comprehend it. He couldn't make sense of any of it. All of his senses seemed wrong. He wanted to look. He wanted to see. What was it? He asked if it was Mum. If Mum was playing some practical joke on him. He knew that she would never do a thing like this, but he asked anyway. The thing didn't respond. Harry looked into the darkness. The place where Mum had been. He thought about calling out to her, screaming for her. He needed her, didn't he? He needed her comfort. But then he remembered her face. The worry. The concern. He remembered that face he hated so much. He didn't want to see that face. Never again. So he took a deep breath. He closed his eyes and remembered what his mum had told him. Monsters aren't real.